There was a moment, brief, silent, almost accidental, when everything changed. It wasn't a vision, nor a prophecy, nor a forbidden secret. It was simply an ancient manuscript, forgotten on a stone shelf where the words "light-bearer" appeared not as an enemy but as a mirror. At that moment I realized that perhaps there are no forbidden stories, only poorly told stories, and that the image we have of evil says more about us than about the universe. Today I want to guide you on a path that doesn't frighten, it awakens. The silence of the mountains has always seemed more honest to me than human discourse. Perhaps that's why it was precisely there, among rocks that seemed to carry millennia on their shoulders, that my understanding of faith began to change. I wasn't looking for dramatic revelations. I was looking for archives, manuscripts, ancient voices that still breathed between yellowed pages. But the further I walked, the more I realized that the books I sought were not merely stored away. They were alive, preserved by entire communities that never succumbed to oblivion. There was something profoundly symbolic about the churches carved into the rock. They weren't built to dominate the horizon, but to blend into it, as if to say, the truth doesn't need to be seen from afar. It needs to be found up close. Inside, amidst candles, smoke, and cold walls, I heard monks speak of texts that were never part of the Bibles I grew up reading, not as mystery, not as sensationalism, but as tradition. They spoke of the Book of Enoch with the same naturalness with which we speak of the Gospels. They spoke of the Book of Jubilees as we speak of Genesis. What seemed apocryphal to the world was simply continuity to them. And I realized that the formation of what we call the canon was never a straight line, but a mosaic of choices. Some spiritual, others political, others simply practical. There is no single story about how Christianity began. There are multiple memories that intersect, complement each other and sometimes contradict each other. What struck me most, however, was not the content of these texts, but the way the communities treated them, not as forbidden relics, but as part of an age-old dialogue between heaven and earth. "Here we are not afraid of questions," said a monk, with a serene smile that seemed to carry centuries of resistance. "Fear is what makes people close books. Faith is what makes them open them." It was there that I understood that spirituality is not born from uniformity, but from the coexistence of different interpretations, and that often the conflict between traditions is not about God, but about how each people has learned to see God. In studying these manuscripts, something became clear. Traditions do not arise in isolation. They form like rivers. Some originate in high mountains, others spring from valleys, but all flow toward the same sea of human seeking. What we call theological differences almost always arise from social contexts. In regions marked by empires, Christ acquired imperial traits. In regions marked by resistance, Christ acquired the traits of the people. In places traversed by drought and war, evil took on forms that spoke of human suffering. In places preserved from external domination, evil appeared more as a test than as a threat. I then realized that the question should never be who is right, but which reading helps to form freer and more conscious human beings. The texts were not written to turn peoples into enemies, but to offer spiritual paths that adapt to the needs of each generation. And this even included the most controversial characters, those whom Western tradition has transformed into absolute monsters, but whom other texts describe in a more complex, sometimes even paradoxical way. As I walked through a dark library lit by only 2 lamps, I noticed a detail that would change everything. The manuscripts did not organize the spiritual world as a battle between 2 opposing realms, but as an interaction of functions. Light and shadow were not enemy armies, but languages through which human faith was matured. There, the accuser did not appear as the sovereign of darkness, but as the one who poses questions, sometimes harsh, sometimes disconcerting, that expose the truth of the human heart. To a Westerner, this seemed dangerous. To them, it seemed merely honest. It was at that moment that I understood. The tradition I knew had taught me to fear, while that ancient tradition taught me to discern. And there is a chasm between these 2 ways of relating to the spiritual. Fear paralyzes. Discernment liberates. Fear creates monsters. Discernment reveals purposes. Fear builds walls. Discernment opens doors. But the most profound impact came not from the theories, but from the people. In small villages, peasants with little more than the essentials spoke of the scriptures with impressive dignity. They said that their faith was not an imposition, it was an inheritance. Not an inheritance from empires, but from ancestors. Not a faith of marble cathedrals, but of hand-carved stones. There I understood that spirituality does not depend on grandeur, but on continuity. And continuity only exists when faith is an exchange and not a demand. Each page I turned showed me something new, but they all pointed to the same idea. No one possesses the whole truth, but everyone carries essential parts of it. When these parts meet, something greater than any doctrine is born. Understanding is born. And understanding is always the first step towards liberation. As night fell and the monks' chanting echoed in the distance, I realized that this was not just a journey. It was a shift in focus. I wasn't there to discover a hidden secret, but to relearn the humility of one who accepts that there is more to the sacred than any single tradition can contain. And that perhaps it is precisely this humility that prepares us to understand spiritual figures who throughout history have been transformed into caricatures, some out of fear, others out of power, others out of ignorance. When I left that library, the mountains seemed higher, the wind colder and the sky wider, not because something outside of them had changed, but because something within me had been rearranged. And it is from this rearrangement that the next step is born, understanding how the images we form of the divine shape the images we form of ourselves, and how this defines our way of living, of loving, and even of confronting what we call evil. Before understanding texts, I needed to understand faces. This realization came unexpectedly during a conversation with a woman carrying a small painting wrapped in fabric. She showed me the image as one might present a beloved relative, a Christ with dark skin, lively eyes, thick hair, a serious yet warm expression. "This is how he walks with us," she said. There was no provocation, no forced contrast with other traditions. There was only the naturalness of someone who recognizes the divine in their own history. It was then that I realized something simple, yet profound. Every people shapes the face of the sacred from their own experience of the world. Where there is oppression, Christ often appears as a liberator. Where there is power, he appears as king. Where there is pain, he appears as a comforter. And where there is resistance, he appears as someone who resembles the people who resist. Theology can write treatises on this, but no treatise is as clear as the gaze of someone who speaks of their God with familiarity. I then began to observe more carefully how different cultures represent Christ. In African icons, he appears strong, with the posture of one who knows the land, with eyes that convey vigilance and tenderness at the same time. In the Middle East, his features are firm, sometimes severe, reflecting the harsh desert climate and the urgency of justice. In Renaissance Europe, he takes on noble features, fair skin, soft lines, shining garments, almost always aligned with the aesthetics of palaces and imperial processions. But what truly matters isn't aesthetics, but rather how each face influences the kind of spirituality that arises around it. Because, throughout this journey, I've discovered that the image we contemplate shapes how we treat others, how we see ourselves, and even how we imagine God reacting to our failings. People who see Christ as a brother tend to cultivate a spirituality of acceptance. People who see him as a judge tend to live with a heavier conscience. People who represent him as a king develop structures of authority. People who see him as a man of the people develop resistance movements. None of these representations are wrong. Each one responds to different human needs. The problem arises when a single image tries to impose itself as universal, erasing the diversity of experiences that gave rise to the others. It's like trying to explain light using only one color. This realization led me to reflect on something even more personal. What was the face of Christ that shaped my faith? I realized that I grew up contemplating an image very distant from my world, as if the divine were something unattainable, too pure for me to fully comprehend. And this led me, without realizing it, to a spirituality based more on guilt than on trust. On many occasions, I wasn't seeking God's presence. I was seeking his approval, as if I constantly had to prove that I deserved to be there. But when I encountered different faces of Christ, especially the Christ represented in the places I visited, something inside me softened. The African Christ, for example, didn't seem inaccessible. He seemed present. He seemed capable of bearing weight, sweat, weariness, like someone who deeply understands human suffering, and that changed everything. Because seeing a Christ who looks like those who suffer changes how we read pain, and seeing a Christ who looks like a marginalized people changes how we see justice, and seeing a Christ who walks in the dust and not among marble columns changes how we understand power. As I walked among different communities, I observed something that kept repeating itself. The closer the face of Christ was to the reality of the people, the freer and more courageous their faith became. Not through the abandonment of reverence, but through the abandonment of inferiority. When the sacred resembles you, your skin, your language, your struggles, faith ceases to be a burden and becomes a right. This perception opened the door to an inevitable question. If we change the image of the Savior, do we also change the image of the adversary? And the answer seemed clear. The more triumphalist the image of Christ, the more monstrous the image of evil. The more human the image of Christ, the more human and more complex the interpretation of evil. I realize that peoples who represent Christ as an imperial symbol tend to see evil as an absolute, external, irreconcilable threat. Peoples who see Christ as a companion, on the other hand, tend to see evil as an internal challenge, something that reveals, confronts, and calls for maturity. These differences are not theoretical. They shape entire lives. A person who grows up fearing evil sees their own shadow as an enemy. A person who grows up with discernment sees their shadow as part of the maturation process. A person who grows up believing in external monsters tries to escape pain. A person who grows up believing in spiritual trials tries to learn from them. I began to notice this in conversations. People who carried the image of Christ as close spoke of faith as a path. People who carried the image of Christ as distant spoke of faith as judgment. And it wasn't their fault. It was simply the result of the images they inherited. In the end, I understood that it is not only God who shapes man. It is the vision we have of God that shapes the kind of humanity we become. This was the point where everything fell into place. The image we have of the sacred is, fundamentally, the image we allow ourselves to have of ourselves. A Christ who welcomes allows you to welcome yourself. A Christ who resembles the people allows you to love your people. A Christ who walks with the humble allows you to rise above guilt. And this change of perspective prepares the ground for the next step. Understanding how the figure of the accuser, interpreted in so many different ways, influences the formation of our spiritual consciousness, not as a threat, but as a mirror that, instead of condemning, reveals. It was only when I began comparing different manuscripts that I realized a simple truth. The figure we call the accuser was never a static character. In some traditions, he appears as the condemned rebel, in others, as the luminous being who was lost through pride, and in still others, especially in Eastern and African traditions, he emerges as an agent of proof, a limited, permitted presence, destined to reveal the authenticity of human faith, not as a sovereign of shadows, but as a function within a larger spiritual drama. I clearly remember the first manuscript that presented this vision. It described a scene that was anything but cinematic, a silent court, without storms, without thunder, without fire, just a celestial assembly, angels all around, a light at the center, and a figure who enters not as a declared enemy, but as a questioner. He does not challenge God. He challenges humanity. He does not raise weapons. He raises questions. And it is these questions that expose the heart. At that moment, something inside me froze, because for the first time, the image I had been taught to fear appeared not as a threat, but as a mirror, as if the function of that being was not to destroy but to reveal, not to corrode faith, but to test it to show its true composition, like fire exposing the quality of metal. It was disconcerting. It was risky, but it was profoundly consistent with something I had always felt, even without knowing how to name it, that a large part of our spiritual struggle does not happen outside, but inside. This interpretation doesn't make evil seem light or innocent. On the contrary, it demands much more maturity because it shifts responsibility. If evil were an autonomous, distant realm, we could blame an external force for our missteps. But if evil is a test, a limit, a tension, it forces us to look inward, to confront the areas we fear facing. It is no longer an absolute enemy. It is an uncomfortable mirror that shows us what we don't want to admit. It is no longer a threat that haunts us. It is a situation that calls us to grow. While reading these pages, I began to understand why some traditions preferred to exclude this type of interpretation. It doesn't allow for childish faith. It doesn't support a theology of fear. It doesn't legitimize power structures based on eternal threat. A faith based on trials and maturation doesn't need watchmen, only guidance. It doesn't need control, only courage. And courage, when well distributed, leaves people too free to fit into rigid hierarchies. Perhaps that's why so many interpretations have disappeared over time, not because they were false, but because they were too liberating. I then began to analyze how these views of the accuser impact people's lives. I realized that those who see evil as sovereign always live in a state of alert, as if every mistake were an irreversible trap. Those who see evil as a test, however, tend to interpret pain as a stage, not as condemnation. A stumble is not destiny, it's learning. A temptation is not a sentence, it's an opportunity for clarity. An internal questioning is not a sign of weakness, but an invitation to discernment. The difference between these two perspectives is enormous. The first imprisons. The second empowers. The first generates fear, the second generates maturity. And what impressed me most was realizing that in communities that embrace this second interpretation, spiritual life is deeper and more human. People speak frankly about their flaws. They don't feign light where there is shadow. They acknowledge the shadow so that the light can shine. They don't try to appear perfect. They try to be true to themselves. I spoke with a spiritual master who told me something unforgettable. Light doesn't need to win over darkness. It only needs to show what darkness hides. And in fact, that phrase seemed to summarize the entire cosmology of those ancient texts. Shadow doesn't exist to compete with light, but to reveal where the light hasn't yet reached. This completely changed my understanding of the accuser. He wasn't the Lord of Shadows, but the shadow that indicates where the light needs to touch. This perspective also clarified something I had always considered contradictory. Why did such ancient texts describe this being as a figure present in the celestial assembly? Why does he appear asking questions of God himself? Why is his action limited by divine mandates? Why is his function, described in so many traditions, less destructive and more revelatory? The answer, in the traditions I found, was clear. Because the trial is part of the path, not a deviation from it. This understanding led me to an even deeper insight. If the accuser is a mirror, then the true battlefield is not heaven, it is consciousness. The war is not between distant kingdoms, it is between versions of ourselves. The fall is not cosmic, it is internal, and so is the victory. Suddenly, spiritual life ceased to be an epic story and became an intimate journey. Not a struggle between incomprehensible entities, but a contest between the truth that calls to us and the fear that paralyzes us. I then realized that perhaps the greatest power of this accuser is not to wound but to lie. It's not about destroying with force, it's about distorting with narrative. And that makes sense. Most human wounds are born not from monsters, but from thoughts. Not from invisible attacks, but from inner voices that repeat, "You are not worthy, you won't succeed, you are not enough." And perhaps that is precisely why some traditions call it the examiner, because it presses our certainties to reveal whether they are roots or just leaves. From that point on, my perspective was never the same. Evil ceased to be something that hunted me. It became something that questioned me. And in understanding this, I began to comprehend the function of this spiritual figure in a more human and responsible way, as that which compels us to look inward and choose truth, not ease, courage, not despair, purpose, not fear. This understanding paves the way for something even more transformative, the relationship between history, power, and spirituality, because if the image of the accuser changes how we confront pain, then the narratives we tell about him also shape how entire societies are governed. And this leads us to the next stage of this journey, understanding how stories shape destinies and how distorted versions can imprison an entire people. Throughout my travels and readings, I've realized that no spiritual force shapes people's destinies as much as the stories they believe about themselves. And this applies to individuals, families, entire peoples. There are places where people grow up believing they were born to carry burdens, not to make decisions. There are places where they believe prosperity is a privilege of the few. There are places where they believe pain is punishment. And there are places where they believe pain is a passage, All of this stems from narratives, some written in books, others repeated for generations, others whispered by one's own conscience. The more I spoke with monks, pastors, elders, and scholars, the clearer it became. Whoever controls the narrative controls people's inner world, and in a way also controls their choices, their fears, their hopes. It's no exaggeration to say that wars begin in the mind long before they begin on the battlefield. In fact, almost all oppression is born, first, from a story that someone told and that others believed. There are peoples who have been convinced for centuries that they were less than they truly were. There are peoples who have been taught to fear the sacred instead of engaging in dialogue with it. And there are peoples who have been educated to see evil as the absolute sovereign, which inevitably creates a paralyzed spirituality shaped by guilt, anxiety, and the thought that any mistake is irreversible. When you believe you are being watched by an invincible enemy, you begin to live as a spiritual fugitive, always hiding, always afraid, always asking permission even to exist. But when you grow up hearing a different story, one in which evil doesn't reign, but tests, doesn't destroy but reveals, doesn't govern but exposes, your outlook on life changes completely. Pain doesn't become lighter, but becomes understandable. Stumbles don't stop hurting, but cease to define. The shadow doesn't disappear but loses its power to paralyze you. This is perhaps the great difference between narratives based on fear and narratives based on truth. Fear creates slaves. Truth creates whole people. In one of the communities I visited, I met a spiritual master who said that the human mind is like a house with many windows. If you only open the window of fear, he said, all that comes in is cold wind. He continued, but if you open the window of understanding, light enters. And where light enters, even the shadow reveals its true form. This simple and poetic teaching was used by them to explain why stories need to be chosen carefully. A narrative is not just a text, it's a lens, and a lens can reveal details or distort them. I spoke with women who had experienced profound losses, and I realized how the narrative shaped their responses to grief. Some, influenced by traditions that see evil as an autonomous realm, spoke as if carrying an eternal cross. I must have done something to deserve this. God is punishing me. Nothing I do helps. Others, influenced by readings that see evil as a test, spoke with an impressive silent strength. This broke me, but it didn't destroy me. I didn't want this test, but I'm going to get through it. If this reveals something about me, I want to learn. It's as if a small change in the narrative, just one sentence, altered the entire axis of life. This difference is also evident in how each culture constructs its ethics. Where evil is seen as the absolute enemy, the moral focus generally falls on avoiding failure. Where evil is seen as a test, the moral focus falls on growing despite it. In the first case, people become experts at blaming themselves. In the second, experts at persevering. And curiously, societies based on fear tend to produce more silence than confession, because when the fall is irreversible, no one dares to admit weaknesses. Societies based on discernment, on the other hand, produce more truth. People speak of their shadows because they know that the shadow is not destiny. It is a diagnosis. This is where history gains an almost political power. Narratives of fear create docile peoples, easy to control, always waiting for orders, always fearing consequences. Narratives of maturity create resilient peoples, capable of questioning, rethinking, and rebuilding. In a society that believes evil is sovereign and God is distant, leaders gain authority through intimidation. In a society that believes evil is limited and God is present, leaders gain authority through example. I spent days reflecting on how this dispute between narratives even permeates the scriptures. Because what is said about evil inevitably determines the type of spirituality that is cultivated. When evil is a tyrant, faith becomes submission. When evil is a test, faith becomes courage. When evil is the ruler of darkness, the faithful live with their heads bowed. When evil questions intentions, the faithful live with an awakened heart. That is why some traditions preserve broader interpretations, even if they cause discomfort, because these interpretations liberate. They liberate from the idea that we are eternal victims of invisible forces. They liberate from the feeling that any failure is a death sentence. They liberate from the posture of submission, replacing it with responsibility. And above all, they liberate from the lie, that lie that says we are less than we really are. At the end of this stage of the journey, I understood something that may be the key to everything. Evil does not govern by force. It governs by stories, by the narrative that convinces us that we are weak, lost, unworthy, incapable, by the story that whispers that the shadow is greater than the light, by the idea that we are condemned even before we try. And when we believe this, we live inside the cell that we ourselves keep locked. But if evil can imprison through narrative, truth can liberate through narrative as well. And this leads us to the final step of this journey, understanding that in the end, it all comes down to a choice. A silent, intimate, profound choice about the kind of story you decide to inhabit and about who you will become within it. Getting here has shown me a truth that, though simple, carries a transformative weight. Everything in spiritual life, absolutely everything, returns to the story we choose to believe. Not the story written in stone, not the story declared by authorities, but the silent story we carry within, the one that guides our steps when no one is watching. This intimate story can lift us up or bury us. It can liberate us or imprison us, and often we do so without realizing it. After so many encounters with monks, travelers, researchers, peasants, stone librarians, I realized that the greatest spiritual revolution doesn't happen when we discover a secret hidden in the heavens, but when we discover a secret hidden within ourselves, that we have the power to change our narrative. And changing our narrative isn't about denying the past, pretending the pain didn't exist, or erasing scars. Changing our narrative is about changing the perspective from which we tell our own life story. I met people who had gone through profound tragedies, losses, betrayals, illnesses, and who could easily have constructed a narrative of defeat for themselves. But they chose something different. One woman told me, "Pain didn't choose me to kill me. It chose me to show me who I really was." Another, who had lost everything she considered essential, asked me, "If evil only reveals and doesn't dominate, then what has it revealed in me?" That was the question that changed everything. Not, "Why did this happen to me?" but "What is this showing me?" These people did not deny suffering. They did not romanticize it. They did not minimize it. But neither did they give it the right to define who they were. They understood something that many ancient texts try to say symbolically and poetically. The shadow has no power over those who walk towards the light. It may frighten, but it cannot stop. It may delay, but it cannot destroy. And, paradoxically, it may even help, because the shadow reveals where the light still needs to enter. This understanding changes your attitude towards life. Instead of fearing each trial as if it were a sentence, you begin to see it as a process. Instead of believing that pain degrades you, you begin to realize that it deepens you, and little by little you stop being haunted by shadows and begin to walk as someone who knows that the light is not a distant refuge, but an inner fire that needs to be fed. Throughout this journey, I began developing a small exercise for myself, and it became so useful that today I share it with anyone who wants to begin a life-changing experience. The exercise is simple. Choose a sentence that summarizes the truth you want to inhabit. It doesn't need to be long, it doesn't need to be theological, it doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be true for you. Something like, "I am greater than the fear I inherited. I overcome, I don't break. Light grows where I allow it. Trials are not punishment, they are refinement." Repeat this phrase when you wake up, when fear grips you, when doubt arises. Gradually, it ceases to be just a set of words and becomes a foundation, the starting point of a new narrative. And why does this work? Because the human mind is organized by stories. It needs meaning, it needs sequence, it needs a beginning, middle, and end. If you don't choose your narrative, someone else chooses it for you, be it a rigid tradition, an old fear, a traumatic experience, or even the inner voice that has learned to diminish itself. Well-chosen narratives build resistance. Poorly chosen narratives build walls. And mature spirituality consists precisely in this, in learning to distinguish between the voice that liberates and the voice that imprisons, between the voice of truth and the voice of lies, between the voice that illuminates and the one that distorts. It was at this point in the journey that I returned to thinking about the figure of the accuser. He doesn't disappear when we choose a good narrative. He doesn't stop asking questions. He doesn't stop provoking, but he loses something fundamental, the power to define us. The evidence continues to exist, but the interpretation changes. The pain continues to exist, but the story changes. The shadow continues to exist, but the meaning changes. And when the meaning changes, the path changes. I remember a mentor who told me something I'll never forget. Faith is not what you believe about God. It's what you believe about who you are in God's presence. That phrase struck me like a thunderbolt, because that's what transforms a life. Realizing that you are not a spiritual fugitive trying to escape an invincible evil, but a human being in process, being revealed, molded, deepened. And this change in attitude alters everything. The way you love, work, suffer, and resist. At the end of my travels, I sat on a mountain and watched the sun rising behind a narrow valley. The world seemed divided. On one side, the shadow still stretched out its arms. On the other, the light began to touch the stones. And I realized something that is perhaps the greatest lesson of all. Light does not conquer shadow by expelling it, but by occupying the space that was once its own. And that is exactly what happens within us. The shadow is not defeated by force. It is dissolved by truth. Therefore, the final question of this journey is not about ancient texts, nor about interpretations, nor about traditions. It is a simple, yet profoundly intimate question. Which story do you choose to live? The fear that paralyzes you, the guilt that diminishes you, the sovereign enemy that convinces you you're always losing, or the revelation that invites you to mature, or the light that grows each time you tell yourself the truth. In the end, all faith returns to this choice. A choice that doesn't need to be announced to the world, only sustained in silence. Because true freedom doesn't begin when you change the world, but when you change the story that guides you from within. And when the narrative changes, destiny changes with it.